Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Stipe Miocic, and you're listening to MMALatestNews.com.
It's time to roll, baby.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to MMA Latest. I'm here with James. We're going to have a MMA debate. It's been a little while since we've done one of these, but the fact that UFC 252 is tomorrow now, and you know this trilogy bout is being touted as the winner comes out as the greatest heavyweight of all time. James, if I had to put it to you, who would you say is the greatest heavyweight of all time, and is the winner on Saturday night in that number one position for you?
I'll tell you what, Mitch, I thought you were going to ease me in a couple of nice little questions, but you thrown it right on me. Who is the greatest heavyweight of all time? I think that question could well be answered on Saturday night, Mitch. Daniel Cormier, Stipe Miocic. There's a case to be made that Daniel Cormier is the greatest fighter of all time, full stop. His only losses, of course, coming to Stipe Miocic and Jon Jones. Stipe himself is in the conversation for greatest heavyweight of all time. And Jon Jones, arguably the greatest fighter of all time. And some people would say those losses don't even count due to, the fact that Jon Jones was on steroids for those fights. So Daniel Cormier has to be up there with one of the greatest fighters of all time. Is he the best heavyweight if he wins? It's difficult to say because his only successful title defense was against Derek Lewis. And he's fought in the UFC at heavyweight twice. His first win against Stipe Miocic was explosive, to say the least. I remember it being pretty obvious in the breakdown. I thought, Stipe Miocic likes to throw those traditional, those Golden Glove style, those 1-2 shots, straight right hand, and that's the power shot, the shot that he knocks people out with. Daniel Cormier rolls down to his right-hand side. That's why he was caught by Jon Jones, because he leaves his hands down. That's why Jon Jones was able to land that left high kick. Stipe Miocic, not traditionally much of a kicker, so Cormier was able to take advantage of that, and especially the fact that Stipe tends to leave his hands down the clinch. Obviously, in the rematch, Stipe worked on that and he wasn't being caught by the same things. But we look at Daniel Cormier, what he did in the UFC. People can say, yes, only one title defense, but people forget what he achieved in Strikeforce. He went into that Grand Prix and absolutely ran right, beat some really good names in there, didn't he, Mitch? And surely that has to be considered.
100%. And the fact that, we kind of forget he made his debut in the UFC at heavyweight and beat Frank Mir and obviously Roy Nelson before he moved to light heavyweight, because obviously his good friend and a champion we'll talk about in Cain Velasquez very soon. He moved down the weight class out of respect for him. But I think the Strikeforce stuff obviously does count towards his accreditation, because obviously it's what got him into the UFC, it's what got him on the mark and on people's minds, really. I think that maybe there's a better argument for him being the greatest light heavyweight, because as you said, his only losses after Jon Jones, who, wasn't a clean fighter when he lost to him. So, he's comfortably number 2, maybe number 3 if you want to put Alexander Gustafsson up there, perhaps, especially in brief.
You can't say Gus is better than Cormier, surely, Mitch.
But I think those two are definitely 2 and 3 if you take, if you put Jon Jones at number 1. But again, it's obviously how clean was Jon Jones in all of those fights, and they're just the ones that he got caught on that he was taking performance-enhancing drugs on.
1,000,000%. I think Jon Jones was on drugs throughout his entire career. I think it's very rare somebody just pops for one fight. Anderson Silva, again, probably on it his entire career, and that taints his legacy. That's why a lot of people put GSP as the GOAT, because he's the only one of these, elite caliber fighters that hasn't tested positive. But then again, there were even rumours about him. And of course, there was a Vaseline gate, wasn't there, with Georges St-Pierre? So at the elite level, Daniel Cormier is probably the cleanest one out there. I can't think of another that really competes with him in that regard.
But even then, on that caliber, Daniel's probably on another level above.
Yeah, Bisping and Daniel Cormier have legacies for different reasons. Daniel Cormier is one of the greatest of all time. Bisping was the pioneer of British martial arts and was the personification of never giving up. That's Michael Bisping's resume. The fact that that's his legacy. The fact that he just never gave up. He kept trying, no matter what the odds were, no matter how many times he lost, he kept getting back up. Whereas Daniel Cormier, it's that greatness that he's looking for. For people to say, there's never been a better fighter alive than Daniel Cormier, and that could well be the case. But Stipe Miocic is going to want to disprove that himself. And when we talk about the greatest of all time, Miocic is never, ever mentioned. And for me, he gets so harshly critiqued because this is a man who defended the heavyweight championship 3 times. He won it against Verdum, who was also one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, out in Brazil. Absolutely silenced that crowd. Beat JDS, beat Overeem in Cleveland, then beat Ngannou when a lot of people said he was going to lose to Ngannou. Ngannou's a freak hit, and Ngannou's looked as equally explosive in his follow-up fights. You know, he's had 3 first-round knockouts back-to-back against extremely high level of competition. So Miocic, for me, is extremely discredited, and I'm just confused as to why his name's not mentioned among the greats of just fighting in general.
Yeah, 100%. I think Miocic does get overlooked. Maybe because he's not much of a talker, and obviously I feel like this weekend it's almost the battle of the good guys, because you've got Miocic is a renowned firefighter, and he does a lot of his work. He gets a lot of respect for that. And it's only recently with Miocic he's done a lot more talking in terms of rivalry, building that sort of side of this game up, the mentality side of it. But I think Miocic is definitely up there, and the fact that we're 25, 26 years deep into the sport, and the heavyweight title's only been defended 3 times, and that's the record. And you're looking at Daniel Cormier, who's on 1. It's absolutely ridiculous, and these are considered the greatest of all times. It's one of those ones where the history of the heavyweight division is a great one, but it's not very deep in terms of there's specifics you pick out, but it's not like we've had an Anderson Silva who's gone on a 16, on such a devastating run in that division.
Yeah, when you weigh 14 stone and you're wearing 4-ounce gloves, the title's just going to change willy-nilly, isn't it? But you've still got those elite names, those Miocics, those Cormiers. You know how classy they are. Of course, we talked about Fabricio Verdum. I mean, outside of the UFC, you've got Fedor Emelianenko. Again, in the UFC, Frank Mir, one of the greats to ever do it, a 2-time world champion. Obviously, we've interviewed Frank, and he's got a fantastic resume. There's so many big names, even people who haven't won the title, like Overeem, and obviously Lesnar has. There's so many big names that heavyweight division. Mark Hunt, another huge name. I mean, obviously he's not quite the caliber of the others, but he's a superstar in his own right. So I think the heavyweight division's got a little bit more depth than it's given credit for. Obviously, these 2 men stand out and beyond as the best, and then you've got probably Ngannou coming through, and then John Jones potentially coming up with light heavyweight. But there you're only sort of 4 names, and obviously you can potentially fling Curtis Blades in after that. It's not the strongest division right now, but I do think there's been a lot of big names there.
100%. I think we're getting to that stage now where it's almost a passing of the torch. We've got the old guard in terms of Miocic and Daniel Cormier leading the top 2. But I think within the next year or 2, we're going to see them really, them 2 are going to be retired, and we're going to see the new breed. Even though Ngannou's quite, he's in his mid-30s, he's not exactly young, but he's still considered young in the sport because he started one so late, and he's still very fresh in the people's minds as a prospect recently.
Yeah, Francis Ngannou hits like a freight train, so he spends about 3 seconds in the octagon every time he steps in there. Therefore, he's got 0 miles on the clock. So he's got a long, long career ahead of him. Obviously, he's always got the possibility of being ragdolled by the octagon. That's always going to be the case. But it's difficult to do when you hit as hard as Ngannou. I mean, he's faced good wrestlers. Curtis Blades is a great wrestler and ended up on his back twice, didn't he? So you can never rule Ngannou out. He's a freak puncher, and I think he's more than likely to become the heavyweight world champion again. These 2 men, Daniel Cormier, 40, Stipe, I think, is 37. This could be the last fight for both of them. Daniel Cormier's already said that this is going to be the last walk, irrespective of result. Stipe Miocic, I think, is more likely to continue, but again, he's got a lot of miles on the clock. How long can he keep going for? So you've got this new breed coming through, Francis Ngannou. I don't think they'll match him up with Curtis Blades because we've seen that fight twice. So maybe you get a rematch between Ngannou and Lewis. And don't get me wrong, it was a horrendous fight first time round. But I think that was mostly because Francis Ngannou had lost so much comfortability after the Miocic fight, so much confidence. So I think that could be an explosive fight next time around. And I think the Black Beast is only getting better. He looked in magnificent shape in his last fight when he knocked out Olenek, didn't he?
100%. I think, as you say, that fight wasn't the greatest spectacle the first time around, but I think the fact that Ngannou's coming in with so much confidence, I think the fact that Lewis is actually injury clear, I know, after that fight, he admitted he had a broken back, I believe, or close to a broken back, especially after the Daniel Cormier fight, and he had some time away even after the Junior Dos Santos TKO. So it's interesting to see what we get a full caliber fight between the 2. And it is the only fight that really makes sense because obviously Ngannou's beating everyone below him other than Derek Lewis.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mitch. I can't say anything wrong with that. I mean, we're talking about all these great heavyweights, and obviously Ngannou hits extremely hard, and if he beats Derek Lewis and becomes a world champion, great. What will his legacy be? Can he go down as one of the greatest if he just knocks everybody out? Or do you think he'll have that Deontay Wilder type effect where people don't give him that credit? Because as much as Deontay Wilder did, he had, 12 defenses in the boxing world. Because of his lack of fundamental skill, he was never going to be considered a great. Do you think Francis Ngannou's in a similar sort of boat?
Well, you can say that Miocic fight. I'll give you a little fact here. He spent less time in the octagon against all the opponents he's beat than he did against Miocic in that one fight. Miocic obviously went 25 minutes. I think it was about 19 minutes if he had all his wins inside the octagon, which is ridiculous, for the caliber of fighter he is. You could say that. You'd almost see Miocic almost being given the quote-unquote the Tyson Fury standard, where he's got more all-rounded skill set, maybe a higher IQ, whereas you can almost tout Ngannou as not a knockout merchant, but the fact that he's done a lot of this work via knockout. You could put comparisons with Deontay Wilder, and maybe doesn't get the props he deserves. But I still think he's the most scary prospect, probably in the UFC, definitely in the heavyweight division.
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, I wouldn't call him a prospect. I'd say he's a real potential champion. I mean, I'd expect him to win, to pick up a vacant title if there is one, unless potentially John Jones steps up and fights back to his best. But if Jones turns up, how he turned up against Reyes or Santos, it'll get his head taken off. And obviously, we'd expect a much more motivated Jones against Ngannou, but you'd be on the edge of your seat regardless. But I want to go a little bit back. Let's go back, say, to UFC 100, when we're looking at like Frank Mir and Brock Lesnar, talking about the best heavyweights of all time. Frank Mir surely doesn't get the credit he deserves because this man was a two-time champion. He beat Silva, he has wins over Lesnar. And of course, you've got Brock Lesnar, who, yes, probably wasn't the caliber of those names, but at the same time, he was struggling with injuries throughout his career. We don't know how his career would have gone had those injuries not come into effect. And additionally, is your legacy just about how good you are? Not for me. Conor McGregor is not the greatest fighter of all time, but he's remembered as one of the greats because he was an absolute superstar. And in his own right, Brock Lesnar probably has a similar effect.
100%. I think you could probably put Ronda Rousey in that bracket as well. I think, I agree with you that Conor McGregor isn't one of the greatest, but I definitely feel he's like the most influential fighter we've seen. And I think Brock Lesnar and Ronda Rousey, with what they've done to the game as well. Because obviously Brock Lesnar brought in his own fan, another huge fan, he brought new eyes to the sport because of his time in WWE, of course. And Ronda Rousey obviously pioneered the women's game for the UFC as well. And then Conor McGregor came in and, doubled what those two had even done, and probably even more so than just doubled it. But it's a difficult one. Obviously, you've got to bring in stories into account. I think the Frank Mir rivalries, the rivalry with Lesnar that he had, it's an interesting one. But I think we've got a tendency to bring the most recent fighters in, and there is a strong recency bias in the fact that we look at Daniel Cormier, Stipe Miocic, even Cain Velasquez, who's a lot more recent than Frank Mir is as a champion.
Yeah, but Cain Velasquez, I mean, we're segueing quite nicely, actually, because, of course, Brock Lesnar beat Frank Mir, and then the belt was taken off him by the absolute prime version of Cain Velasquez, who absolutely dismantled Lesnar. Lesnar was this scary, scary, frightening man. And, of course, in that Frank Mir loss, he was winning the fight, and then he got caught in a submission. Whereas against Velasquez, he was bullied, he was bruised. And this is somebody who, different sport, WWE, but kids grew up fearing. This was a man who they painted out to be invincible. In the UFC, he was just this physical specimen, this monster. And then Cain Velasquez absolutely battered him. An amazing wrestler. Unbelievable cardio. I mean, he's been plagued with injuries, but if he hadn't, surely he'd stand in his own right as potentially the best to ever do it in the heavyweight division. Definitely,
I think he would be. And obviously, we can't take away from what the Doom done, but the acclimatization problems that he had going into that fight, you could almost beg a question if it was in a different state, perhaps. We might have had a different outcome. He could have won that fight and continued his great legacy that he has.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you go from Cain Velasquez on, and this is just weird because it's how quick the heavyweight title changed hands. Fabricio Verdum submitted Cain Velasquez. Fabricio Verdum had also beaten Fader. Let's not forget that. I think Fabricio Verdum might well be the most underrated fighter in UFC history because he did so much. He ended that unbelievable run by Fedor Emelianenko, then submitted Cain Velasquez for the UFC heavyweight title. I mean, even now at 42 years of age, he's beaten the likes of Gustafsson. He's done so much for the sport.
He's 100% the the greatest heavyweight in terms of the ground game that he is and the jiu-jitsu game because he's so quick as well. You wouldn't expect him to be a 240, 250 pound man the way he moves around the octagon. And as you said, he looked great against Gustafsson. He looked okay against Olenek. He looked a bit fatigued, a bit tired, but that's probably because he had a 2-year layoff. I think the question mark against his name was the USADA aspect of it. I think, again, with the Brock Lesnar stuff, Brock Lesnar tested positive, even with John Jones. I think once you have that question mark of how clean are you, how fair are you, it almost drops you out of the question immediately.
Yeah, Fabricio Verdum, at the end of the day, was taking performance-enhancing substances. And I've met Frank Mir, and I've got a great deal of respect for him. He gave me an interview, he gave me his time. But, again, he tested positive, as did Brock Lesnar. So there's 3 names there that are somewhat out of the mix already. But somebody who, to my knowledge, never tested positive and was fighting against a lot of people who, let's face it, probably were on drugs. Fedor Emelianenko, the original heavyweight GOAT. And let's not forget everything he did in the sport. Yes, outside of the UFC, but organisations like Pride was how MMA was built.
100%, I know Dana White has come out and said his biggest sort of regret at the moment was not making Lesnar versus Fedor. That would have been one hell of a fight. The fact that you've got probably 2 of the biggest names at the time from different organisations and sides of the world coming together to compete. That would have been some spectacle, wouldn't it?
Oh, 1,000,000%, Mitch. It would have been incredible. I think it's a real shame that Fedor didn't come over. When we look at the greats who've never competed in the UFC, I think people over the years have mentioned, the likes of Ben Askren and Fedor. And then Ben Askren, of course, eventually did fight in the UFC. So Fedor, for me, stands alone as just the absolute best who never tested his skill sets in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And that's a real shame. But it shows how big a star he was that all the hardcores still have him as arguably the best heavyweight of all time. And now, Mitch, we have to do something a little bit difficult. I think we should probably put together a little top 5 of the greats. And you mentioned Verdum there. For me, he would be in that top 5, but you of course brought up the fact that he was on steroids. Are we including him?
I think it's almost hard not to because he beat Cain Velasquez, who was so devastated. I was saying to you, I put a little list of 4 together. I think you could put Fedor above him because of the body of work he'd done. And the fact that it's weird because obviously the Doom beat Fedor, as you said. So it almost puts him above him on terms of their matchup. But the fact that Fedor's, as we know, as far as we know, has been clean his whole career. And, he's done, 2 decades of work. It's just incredible how much.
And he's still winning now.
He's still going. Beating Rampage.
Exactly. And then, of course, he retired after that fight. But the guy just has this mystical element to him, doesn't he? It's like watching The Undertaker walk into the ring in terms of WWE. He has that sort of almost supernatural feel to him. There's something a little bit special about the Russian Empire, but I think that means that we're putting Verdum at 5. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, we had a huge back and forth that nearly came to blows before the show. Me, obviously complaining that Mark Hunt is the greatest heavyweight of all time. But we're going to go in at number 4. Obviously, the names I think we've been left with, we've got the DC, we've got Stipe, we've got Fedor, we've got Cain. I think for the fact that he campaigned mostly at light heavyweight, do you throw DC in because he only has that 1 win, that 1 win at heavyweight? Does that put him as the number 4? Then again, he won the strike fight. It's so hard to put these 4 in order, but do you go with DC out of those 4?
Maybe it's difficult. I think that this probably is a bit biased because we never saw him in the UFC. But as you said, he used Ben Askren as the analogy there. And I'm hoping, had we gone back in the parallel universe, it would have happened with Fedor in the UFC. But you could see him maybe coming in and getting cleaned out straight away. Maybe his legacy would have been, a lot more tainted than it would be, and than it has been. Or he's got a very good legacy. It would be interesting to see how different that would have been in the UFC had he made that move. So personally, I put Fedor at 4 just because he hasn't made that move over. But then again, his body of work is impeccable.
Yeah, I'm just going to have a quick Google, have a look at his record, because there's name after name after name on that Fedor Emelianenko record. And there could be a case to make, if we look at this, that, he's the best heavyweight of all time. I mean, we're going to have to compare his resume to other people. But if we get his record here, look, he's on it. You've got Rampage Jackson, Chael Sonnen, Frank Mir, Let's have a look for some more big names.
Tim Sylvia.
Andrei Arlovski, Tim Sylvia, Mark Hunt, Mark Coleman, Mirko Krokop, Nogueira, Kevin Randleman, Mark Coleman again, Gary Goodridge. I mean, we're really going back to the early days here. Nogueira, I mean, this man, you've got to say that's the best heavyweight resume of all time, surely.
Again, it's up there. It is up there. And the fact that he's beat some big names at the latter stage of his career, like the Rampage check from the Chelsea and Frank Mears, his body work probably is the best. But again, it is just that question of what would he have done in the UFC. I think had he had a decent run in the UFC, perhaps, I think he'd be held more aloft in that top heavyweight bracket. But again, it's the one. At the very minimum, he's probably third. I'd imagine. He's fourth, definitely. I think you could have arguments that Kane goes above him. Stipe probably goes above him just about because of his 3 title defenses. So it's between. It's so difficult. It's a difficult one to build on, isn't it? And
I mean, I don't know if you can put all those wins below 1 win for DC. As good as the win it was, and as classy and upright as DC, because we're not taking that away from him, he's still in the top 5. And as much as I like him, it's just 1 victory. Fedor was doing this for so long, and there's so many names there. But obviously, there is that question of what he would have done in the UFC, and that is the pinnacle.
100.
You know, it's like it's so. I'm not saying. Obviously, Pride was an exceptional organisation, but it's people don't give darts players the same respect if they're winning in the BDO, or wrestlers the same respect if they're in TNA. You need to be in the UFC. So I mean, for us, does that put DC at 4, Fedor at 3, and does that leave us with a competition between Cade and Stipe for the best of all time?
Yeah, you know, I could give you that. I think DC has a great body of work, but as you said, the majority of that work is in a different position at light heavyweight. He was the first ever light heavyweight champion to move up and, you know, gain that title in the heavyweight division. So I think his achievements make him definitely top 2, but his body of work pretty brings him down a little bit, I would say. So yeah, we've put Fedor at 4, DC at 4, Fedor at 3. But I think Miocic has to be number 1 just because he's made the most title defenses. I think it's definitely hard to get past that. And that he has beat DC already. And then Ngannou, who was on a huge hot streak, and Verdun, who took it off Cain Velasquez.
1,000,000%. Those 2 heavyweights are brilliant. Just people forget how good Cain was in his prime. His cardio was through the roof. And if it wasn't for injuries, who knows how good he could have been. But we're not in a game of if, buts and maybes, are we? We're in a game of absolutes. And Stipe Miocic just absolutely proved that he's 1,000,000% the real deal. He's achieved everything in this sport. So as of right now, I'll happily agree with you. We'll put Cade at 2, we'll put Stipe at 1. Of course, if Stipe was to win this weekend, that will further enhance that resume and put him, you know, probably a step above them all. But if DC wins, does he rocket up to the top?
Yeah, I think he'd probably elevate to number 2. I think if he wins it, it'd be interesting to see, because I know Dana has come out and said he probably doesn't want DC to retire just yet. You see a lot of times where Dana's like, you need to retire right now. You've not got nothing left in the tank. But it's very much the opposite with DC at the moment. It'd be interesting. There's been a couple mentions of John Jones moving up. Could you make the trilogy fight? If he put enough money in front of DC, it'd be interesting to see whether he could make that. And obviously, if he beat, let's say he beats Stipe and then he goes to defend his title again for a second time, he's then only 1 away from Miocic, who holds the record. But I was saying to Lance the other day, I don't want to see DC's career go out on a whimper. If he does win the heavyweight title on Saturday night, I want him to ride off into the sunset. I don't want him to come back, defend his title. If he loses it, he might, you know, you see a lot of fighters come out and say, oh, I'll just win 1 more, then I'll retire. But they might never get that win. So they end up carrying 5, 6, 7 fights too late into their career, which I don't want to see for DC. One, he's got a career with the UFC for life anyway, doing what he's doing on the mic, and, you know, he's a great ambassador for the sport and for the UFC itself. So I think he's got a lot more to give outside of the cage at the moment than he does inside the cage.
I think you've just hit the nail on the head, Mitch. I couldn't have worded it better myself. Daniel Cormier has nothing left to prove in this game. He's done it all. He's an Olympian. He's a Strikeforce heavyweight champion. He's a UFC 2-time light heavyweight champion, a heavyweight champion. What more do you need to do? He can sail off into the sunset. He doesn't need to get punched in the head late into his 40s. His legacy's sealed. If he wins on Saturday, brilliant. 2-time heavyweight champion. But if he doesn't, he's still one of the greatest to ever do it. And Daniel Cormier will have a career for as long as anything because he's articulate, he's good on the mic, he's a great person, and he explains the sport brilliantly. So Daniel Cormier doesn't need to carry on. He doesn't need to take that legacy. If he, let's say, does beat Miocic, then he fights Jones for a third time, and then gets cleaned up by Jones again, we just remember him then for being Jones's punching bag. I mean, that's harsh because obviously Cormier was competitive in the fights, but you get what I mean? I don't want the career of Daniel Cormier to be defined by John Jones. I feel when he beat Stipe the first time, he was a world champion in his own right. Nobody can go, you're a paper champion, DC, anymore. He proved himself at the absolute pinnacle of sport. He need not do no more after Saturday night, regardless of result. In fact, again, Miocic, he doesn't need to prove anything either. He's in his late 30s. He'll be the greatest heavyweight of all time if he wins. And if he doesn't, he's still in the mix with... He could still make a case that he's the best, even if he loses. Both of these men have done so much, and they're genuine, nice guys. Genuine diamonds, and money hasn't affected them. You see so many heavyweight world champions fall off the wagon, believe in their own hype. These two men are fantastic men, fantastic fighters. Stipe Miocic, the fireman, for God's sake. Like, great characters. I hope they both sail into the sunset because they've got great families and they deserve it.
100%. I think my key question mark with Stipe is that he came out and said he's had a couple of eye injuries, and we saw what happened to Bisping with his eye injury. And that could be a devastating effect in his profession as a firefighter. He loses his sight, he loses that as well as his fight career. So he definitely wants to get out while he's still healthy enough. And I think it'd be nice to see whoever, as you said, it'd be nice to see them both potentially retire because Miocic is 38 as well. He has nothing left to give to the sport, especially if he defends his title. He's clearly ahead in terms of defenses at 4. Everyone else is on 2. So again, whoever wins on Saturday night, I think should retire. And should it be Stipe, I think we see DC retire as well. And then we get a vacant belt, hopefully, between Ngannou and Jones. That would be my dream matchup for that vacant belt.
Yeah, let's see these two legends sail off into the sunset, enjoying the time in the Bahamas, and let's let Ngannou potentially knock out John Jones. But if he doesn't, and John Jones does pick up the heavyweight title, then he'll cement himself as probably the greatest fighter of all time. And he still needs to do that for me.
Yeah, I think so. The fact that we've seen DC, OSP, Gus all fight at heavyweight now, I think he's the next in line to do so. And I think it's going to be interesting. Obviously, everyone at light heavyweight is restricted to 205. It'll be interesting to see what happens when John Jones comes in at 225, 230, and he's got a 260-pound man standing opposite him. That would be some sort of feat as well. Because I think Ngannou coming in 40 pounds heavier will want to fancy himself getting a knockout in that fight. But again, John Jones is, as we know, the most skillful fighter out of the 2.
Well, he's a great mover, John Jones, but he can get hit. He's not got the elite level boxing that Stipe Miocic has, that Golden Gloves caliber. He hasn't. John Jones gets tagged. And if you get tagged by Francis Ngannou, you're going into outer space and you're orbiting Neptune. You're going to get... And if anybody knows the solar system, Neptune's not close. It's a way away. It's not a close planet. We're not just knocking him to a Venus. He's flying away to a gas giant. That's how hard Ngannou hits. And Jones has to be switched on for every single second.
Yeah, that's one hell of a fight. And, we see poor Rotherroom, he felt the full effects of Ngannou. As did Blades, as did Junior Dos Santos, as did Cain Velasquez. Many of the greats that we've seen in the sport, we've seen Ngannou just put them away with ease. And it'd be interesting to see. It would make his career if he beat John Jones. But then you've got arguably the greatest of all time. With skill set, I'd say it's between him and GSP. And obviously the question mark, the whole USADA thing that hangs over John Jones and is outside of the cage entrance. It almost puts him at number 2. But he's definitely, for me, his body of work inside the cage is probably the best. And if Ngannou beats him, that catapults him. Especially, that would be the perfect fight to kick off the first pay-per-view in Africa. That would be absolutely perfect if we did Ngannou Jones. We have, say, Adesanya fight there as well, and then Kamaru Usman did a free-cut fight as a very first one. That would be impeccable for both the sport and for Africa as a continent that is slowly bleeding in MMA fights and a great caliber of fighters from that continent as well.
Yeah, we had that in Australasia, that burst of Volkanovski, Whittaker. You had the same with Africa, of course. Adesanya crosses over both of those continents with a heritage from both countries. But we've got some great African fighters. We've got Ngannou, obviously, Kamaru Usman. Let's start headlining in Africa. I mean, I've been a campaigner that we need to start getting events in Australia and New Zealand more often, especially during this pandemic. It makes no sense to me flying out to Saudi when events are allowed in Australia. Jeff Horn versus Tim Tszyu boxing events going ahead in front of 16,000. I don't know why they're not taking advantage of that, Mitch. I really don't.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I don't know if it's a time zone thing, perhaps the fact that although that didn't bother them in fight, and we're still seeing them fight at 8 a.m. Local time in Abu Dhabi. But it's a weird one. It must be something to do with maybe broadcasting rights that pushes that side of the world out of favour. We've seen it in the UK as well with the pay-per-views, getting them fighters to fight at 4 in the morning and 5 in the morning. It can be a little tricky, but again, with this ESPN Plus deal, you see, or at least hope there's a bit more leeway.
Yeah, I hope so, Mitch. I mean, we've done these Australian fights before. Whittaker versus Adesanya, as much as it pains me to remember it, because, of course, Bobby's one of my favourites. It was still at like 5, 6 in the morning local time in Australia. The fans will turn out for it.
Hey, if Australians, we've got a lot of comparisons to the UK, but we know they love a beer and they love a good scrap, and they've been treated quite nicely over the last couple of years, especially got Home Rousey in Australia as well. The famous knockout, of course. They've had some good treats, but they probably deserve a little more.
Yeah, they do. I mean, we deserve more. We should get about 5 or 6 events a year, not big ones. I'm not saying that we deserve 6 pay-per-views a year. But we should get a fight night every 2 months.
Yeah.
There's no reason not to, really.
Obviously, pre-COVID, we would have got London and Dublin. Obviously, Dublin over in Ireland, but within the close proximity geographically, that would have been nice to see. But unfortunately, both were cancelled. But yeah, we do deserve a couple more events. I was hoping Till with what he brings to the UFC, I think he's probably the next. He could, if he wants to win, if he goes on and wins that title, you could definitely see a pay-per-view in the UK. I think that's the only thing that's almost holding out the UFC from coming over here is the fact that he's not got quite someone who you can go, right, you're a definite title, you're going to challenge the title against a champion within the next year or so.
Yeah, you're right. Obviously, Darren Till, huge star, but not guaranteed to win a world title in the near future. I think there's a good chance he will win one down the line. Leon Edwards is, well, not the biggest star, but a couple of years ago at London, it was headlined by Verdun versus Volkov. You can headline with anybody and it'll sell out, Mitch. The UFC is such a big brand. There's so many fans. If you had a couple more fight nights a year, they'll still sell out. London, a lot of people can't get to London, Mitch, if they live up north. Stick one in Manchester, stick one in Birmingham, stick one in Scotland. They'd still sell.
100%. I think that's where Bellator really strive with their European series. But we'll wrap it up here almost. UFC 4 has come out today. And obviously we've got the addition of Tyson Fury and
the game's out today.
Anthony Joshua on the day this video comes out, of course.
Oh, sorry, Friday. Yeah, I'm all over the place, Mitch.
We all are with this being in, well, I say quote-unquote lockdown in Manchester at the moment. But what was I going to say? Yeah, if you had to put one of them in the cage, I think Tyson Fury has the IQ. AJ probably, AJ you could probably put comparisons with Ngannou, expecting him in there. Expect him to go in there and probably get more knockouts, whereas you'd expect Tyson probably to grind out fights. He's got a higher IQ, and he would probably, if you took him back 10 years, you might be able to blend in that skill set of the MMA fighter with him and his boxing technique. Who do you think would have the best impact on this heavyweight division?
I mean, with 4-ounce gloves, Tyson Fury wouldn't be grinding out decisions.
Sure.
He'd be putting people to sleep in 4-ounce gloves, Mitch. The man, he hits you, it's not going to tickle in 10-ounce. Never mind 4-ounce. Yes, of course, Joshua, the slightly harder puncher. But I think Tyson Fury, the way he's built mentally, he can adapt. And I'm not saying he can become a UFC champion tomorrow, but Francis Ngannou only started very late and really just has a boxing game. Tyson Fury can learn it. Tyson Fury can learn the skills. The heavyweight division is very, very weak. Tyson Fury has the capabilities to at least compete. Not necessarily in the UFC, but he has, I mean, would it shock you if this guy could, make waves in a Bellator? It wouldn't shock me at all. Tyson Fury, I mean, could learn these, could pick up kicks like that. He's that sort of brain. He's a freak in terms of his fight IQ. He really is. I think Joshua would be good, but I think Fury would be that little bit better.
Yeah, and that's almost what I was gazing towards in terms. I think Tyson Fury has got a better skill, better IQ, and a better mindset to pick up skills. I think, you know, if you just maybe brought him back 5 years in his career, maybe I think you could possibly see him specialize. Well, I say specialize, but picking up the wrestling, picking up a good jiu-jitsu game, and I think he probably has a more hope of bringing those skill sets into his game than there's a. With all due respect to Joshua, I think Joshua would come in as more of a knockout artist and really look to keep fights on the feet. But I can imagine Tyson Fury with his mindset, almost wanting to take fights to the ground and wrestle if he had that in his locker.
Tyson Fury is a madman, isn't he? He'll do whatever he fancies doing on the day. He's an erratic character. Yeah. He really is. I mean, so Tyson Fury will probably decide he's a Muay Thai fighter, then a wrestler, then a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He'll probably do like 3 weeks of Jiu-Jitsu, get his white belt, and then suddenly convince himself he could like sub Fabricio Verdum. He's that sort of man, Tyson Fury. He's a real maverick.
And he'd be one of the taller fighters in there as well, wouldn't he, with his stature as well, 6'7", I think.
I mean, outside of Struve, he'd be the biggest, wouldn't he?
That would be great for him, especially with his reach. It would be incredible. What's his usual weight? Is he, in terms of pounds, is he 242?
About 19 still.
Yeah, so he'd have a little bit of a weight cut to do, but I'm sure he'd get in there nonetheless and put on a good scrap.
Absolutely. I mean, he was born and bred bare knuckle fighting, Mitch. He'll know a thing or two about a street fight. Obviously, I'm not saying it's necessarily a street fight, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, it's not the Queensberry rules of boxing, should we say. But obviously, those two should be squaring off AJ and Fury next year. Of course, they've got a couple of fights in between them, but I believe that good for the moment. So I think we're in agreement at the moment. Stipe Miocic is the greatest heavyweight as of this date.
I mean, as of right now, the combined list was in 5th place, a former world champion, a man who ended the legendary streak of Fedor Emelianenko, the man who beat Cain Velasquez via submission, a great fighter, an underrated fighter, Fabricio Verdum. In 4, we have the greatest clean light heavyweight of all time, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. He's won 2 belts in the light heavyweight division. He's won the Strikeforce Grand Prix at heavyweight. He's an Olympian, Daniel Cormier. In 3rd place, the only reason he's featuring here is because he didn't compete in the UFC. But what this man did in Prime was incredible. From beating Silva to Gary Goodridge, to even in his later career, Bellator beating the likes of Son and Rampage Jackson. This man was a staple of MMA, full stop. One of the men who pioneered this sport, one of the men who built it, a man who everybody fears, a man who has an Undertaker-like feel, a man who has a bit of a phenomenal aura around him, like something extraterrestrial almost. It's Fedor Emelianenko. Coming in number 2, freak work rate, freak wrestling, a man who made Brock Lesnar, a WWE superstar, a terrifying man, look like a child, and that is Cain Velasquez. And coming in, taking that number 1 spot, fireman by day, fight by night, the most defenses in heavyweight history, a man with genuine one-punch knockout power, Stipe Miocic. Boom, and that's the MMA Latest Top 5.
100%. I think that is the perfect setup for us to end the video here, guys. Make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe, of course, and we'll be live tomorrow night for the UFC 252 pre-show. It's going to be a phenomenal one. We've got, obviously, a trilogy. Everything ends here. We've got a Sugar Show coming up in the co-main event as well. So some cracking bouts on UFC 252. And we've got to be grateful for the UFC that the fact they're churning out so many fights, so many top fights as well, especially, with the no crowd aspect as well. We've got the rest coming in as well, Bellator, Cage Warriors, all the other organisations are coming through, and make sure to keep it locked to MMA Latest on the social medias for the coverage of those organisations as well. But James, where can they find you on Twitter?
You can find me at JamesSweetenham99. If you're on Insta, j.sweetenham99, and that's where to find me.
No worries. Right. We'll see you guys then on the next video.